Thank you all for coming here this evening. As you heard in the introduction, I tell audiences all the time, whether you like it or not, for better or worse, Kansas City had one of the best mafias in the United States. There are reasons for that. And I'll share with you real quickly how it is, before we jump right into the story, how it is that a guy like me gets to start making films and writing books about these subjects, right? Well, it really has to do with the miniaturization of the filmmaking process. In other words, it used to be that we actually had to shoot on celluloid and we had to edit in what they used to call a linear fashion, right? So you'd have a strip of film and you'd cut the film and you'd intersperse, one strip of film here, or maybe you abut two strips together, something like that, and you do it in a linear fashion. Well, when computers miniaturized that process by dropping it all into a single computer where you had a timeline, they called it nonlinear editing. And nonlinear editing started to become into vogue in the mid-90s, late 90s, but by the early 2000s, it had finally reached a point to where it was very accessible to filmmakers, and everybody was editing at this point in time nonlinear. So what it means basically is in the computer you've got a timeline. Well, you can take a photograph or an interview, a clip of an interview, whatever it is, and drop it in anywhere that you want within the timeline. So it's a nonlinear editing process. And so I, of course, was immediately attracted to this because as you heard, I have a master's degree in radio, TV, and film. That's what I started off in life doing, was producing television, and I was a broadcaster, and I shot tons of television, and I was an anchor man, and I had the legislative television contract in Alaska, and I've shot, video news releases and news stories and industrial films and political position videos, you name it, I've shot it pretty much. I've edited it, written it, whatever it is. So, I was practicing law when all of this new technology came around, and I went out and bought it, right? Just said, man, I gotta have that stuff. This is just great, bought a fancy Macintosh computer, and, it was just like, okay, I'm all set up, I got everything in place. Okay, what do I want to do? I didn't really have a story, I was like, it was kind of like, I went out and, bought the cart before I got the horse, and so, it occurred to me driving down the street one day that nobody had ever done a story on Nelly Don. Now, Nelly Don was the largest dress manufacturer in the history of the world during the 20th century out of Kansas City. They made about 75 million dresses. It's an amazing story. It's both a book and a film, and Nelly Don, not only is it a rags to riches film, she was born in Parsons, Kansas, 12th of 13 children, Irish family, but she started this company in 1916 with her husband, Paul Donnelly. That's how you get Nelly Don. Her name was Nell, and his was Donnelly, and so they inverted it, made Nelly Don. And so they built this fantastic company. In fact, their first warehouse in Kansas City was the Western Auto building downtown, the one with the big, big arrow on it. Yeah. And it used to be called the Coca-Cola building way back in the day. So Nelly Don, she has an affair with a United States Senator named James A. Reed. She has his child while they're both married to other people. And then about 3 months later, in 1931, she was kidnapped. She was kidnapped right across from the UMKC Law School. It's now a toy and miniature museum, 52nd Oak Street, for those of you who know Kansas City geography. And she was held ransom, okay? And James A. Reed at that moment was down here in Jeff City trying the famous Ha Ha Tonka lawsuit, which is about the condemnation of lands in the Ozarks. And he heard about it, and he rushed out of the courtroom, and in so doing, he attracted the attention of reporters and people back at the Kansas City Star who called the police department, so that by the time James A. Reed got to Kansas City, there were reporters and police all surrounding the Nelly Don household. And so he realizes he's made a mistake. And so he holds a news conference and he begs the kidnappers not to hurt Nelly Don. But then he goes on to say, but if you harm one hair on her head, I swear to God, I'm going to spend the rest of my days tracking you down to the ends of the earth and ensuring that you get the most severe penalty under the law, which in Missouri at that time was death by hanging. Then he went into a back room, he picked up the telephone, and he called the Kansas City mob boss, Johnny Lazia. Okay, now that's all I'm going to say about Nelly Don, okay? But it got me thinking. You know, as I was producing and directing Nelly Don, that, you know, nobody had ever given a serious cinematic treatment to the Kansas City mob before. And in the instance of Nelly Don, she wasn't kidnapped by the mob, she was rescued by the mob. And so, you know, this really got my head thinking, going, wow, you know, I mean, why not? I mean, they've done, you know, books and movies about, you know, the Chicago mob, New Jersey mob, and of course New York, and even LA, and Mickey Cohen and all those people out there. Why not Kansas City? And you know, amazing thing happened when I was in the governor's office in Alaska. We had a gambling initiative on the ballot, and so I contacted a Las Vegas TV station and I said, hey, would you send me some video of some gambling so that we can make this position video, you know, opposing, you know, implementing gambling in Alaska. Now that was my governor's position. Frankly, I don't have a position on gambling, for those of you who are pro-gambling. So you know what they did? They sent me this guy's entire documentary film. It was about 28 episodes, all about the Las Vegas Mafia. And it was rich with stuff about Kansas City in it. It had, you know, the Civellas in it, and I mean, you know, right from almost the beginning when they started Las Vegas, Kansas City had its fingers in Las Vegas. As a matter of fact, the first time they came out with the Black Book banning the first 11 people that were banned in the state of Nevada from gambling, 3 of them were from Kansas City. The 2 Civella brothers, Nick and Cork, and a third gangster. I always think of him by his Jewish name. It'll come to me. But anyway, so this third gangster, so the 3 of them are excluded. Well, anyway, so I got this footage in, Max Jabin is his name, sorry. And so I got this footage in like 1989, 1990 maybe. And I was like, wow, look at this. So I just held on to it. You know, I thought, I don't know what'll happen to it. So sure enough, you know, 20 years later, I'm making a film about the Mafia in Kansas City, and I've got this incredible investigative footage that this television station in Las Vegas had done 20-some years earlier. And interesting little sidebar to that is the reporter who did all of that investigation died mysteriously while on vacation in Hawaii. So anyway, so, you know, it occurs to me that nobody has done a story on the Kansas City Mafia. So I start the research process, you know, and, you know, when you research a film or a book, there comes some critical moments when you know you got enough stuff. You know, you keep on researching and you keep on doing it, but at that point in time, you're like, okay, I know I've got enough stuff for a film, or I've got enough stuff for a book. And so it took me 3 years to research and to put together the film. And the film is called Hand Strawman, as is the book. Hand Strawman, and that is a reference to the early Sicilian upon Sicilian extortionary period. And Strawman is the FBI code name into the skimming of the casinos in Las Vegas. So that when they brought all the mobsters back to Kansas City and had the prosecutions, they were called Strawman 1 and Strawman 2. And Strawman was basically a fellow that they allowed to, quote, purchase the casinos with union money, with Teamsters money. And so this guy thought he owned the casinos. He actually believed that he was in charge. And so they had the perfect guy, because he didn't know that the Mafia was the one who was really pulling the strings behind all of the funding. So that's how it gets its name, Hand Strawman. But you can imagine that if you've read Bill Owsley's books, or Frank Haid has a book called The Mafia and the Machine, or if you've read Tom's Town, for instance, it's just like this monstrous litany of names and events, and trying to piece it all together is not some simple task. One of the things that they did, like during Prohibition, they would bust, say, some guys loading a truck full of booze, and in the newspaper they print all their names as being, racketeers. Well, I mean, some of them were just young kids who their Uncle Louie told them to show up at the dock at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning because there was some work. And next thing you know, they get swept up into a bust. But so you have this like huge, just almost a timeline of narrative of personalities that form the Mafia in Kansas City. So I'm sitting there going, how do I organize this? How do I put this into some semblance that people will understand? And so what I did was, I did it by godfathers. And because if you make a film or you write a book, people have to have somebody to glom onto, right? You have to have a personality, somebody that you care about. Like with Nelly Don, it was easy. Everybody loves Nell. And with Tom and Harry, it was about Tom Pendergast and Harry Truman. But with the Mafia, it's this whole succession of people. And so what I did was I took the Black Hand era. There were no, quote, leaders there were people that were engaged in the Black Hand, but the Mafia had not really congealed in the United States yet. But then by the time Prohibition comes around, to the fore comes a guy named Johnny Lazia. Subsequent to him was a guy named Charlie Binaggio, and then subsequent to him was Nick Civella. So that's how the film and the book is organized. We've got the Black Hand era, and then we do it by godfathers. Lazia, Binaggio, and Civella. And so the word Mafia and Black Hand starts to appear in Kansas City in the early 1900s. First reference you actually ever saw of the Mafia was actually a newspaper article in 1903. Kind of a veiled reference. But by about 1909, 1910, in Little Italy in Kansas, murders are starting to occur. Now, you have to appreciate that Kansas City actually had a huge influx of Italians. They were obviously leaving Sicily, in the droves because of the oppressive Mafia system that existed there. And in Italy, the Mafia basically was corrupt governmental officials, corrupt families, corrupt police, corrupt judiciary. And so there was a stranglehold on the economy and the politics, and there was basically no hope for the average peasant in Sicily. So they all hop on boats hoping that they're going to find a better life in America, and the vast majority of them are wonderfully, law-abiding people, right? But along with the, the law-abiding, we want to do better in the world peasants, also come the accompanying criminal element with them. And what they would do is, instead of getting off the boat in New York or Boston, they would hang on and they would sail down to New Orleans. And then they took the riverboats up to St. Louis, and a lot of them got off in St. Louis. You've heard of the Hill area there, big Italian sector. And then a lot of them, though, stayed on because there was a lot of work. Kansas City was in the process, a very dynamic city around the turn of the century, very diverse economy. It was the largest city from Kansas City to Los Angeles or San Francisco until after World War II. So it literally was the embarkment to the Great West. And so a lot of Italians stayed there, and they formed what they called the Italian colony. And it was constantly referred to as Little Italy. So that by the time 1930 rolls around, Little Italy has 30,000 Italians in it. 66% of all of those Italians who came to Kansas City were from Sicily. And so when they heard that there was a Black Hand threat or a Mafia threat against an individual, they took it very seriously. But if you were like, say, from northern Italy, say from Venice or Milan, you were kind of like, what? What are you doing? You're asking me for money and you're going to do what? it didn't resonate with the other Italians quite as much as it did with the Sicilians who had lived under the oppressive system when they were over there. So in 1910, there's an extortion going on. Basically, Sicilians have targeted this one grocery owner and his wife, okay? And they have threatened that if they don't pay money, then harm is going to occur to them. So in December of 1910, this woman named Paulina Pisano is walking from 5th and Holmes in Kansas City to their grocery store, which is about a block away, when she is shotgunned to death at about 5:30 in the morning, just killed, flat out killed. And one of the Black Hand's calling card was to just kill and then drop the weaponry and run. They didn't care if the police found the weapons because you didn't have advanced forensics at that time. And so what happens is there's a guy named Big Joe Ramo. Big Joe Ramo is a Kansas City police officer from Naples. And Big Joe Ramo likes to hang out in the saloons when he's off duty and play cards and pinochle and, you know, the other Italian games. And Big Joe overhears the perpetrators of the Paulina Pisano murder, and he looks at them, and they look at him, and all parties know that everything has been overheard. So what happens? This is in January of 1911. They assassinate Big Joe Ramo, Kansas City police officer. It was a very big deal because you can't have criminals going around gunning down Kansas City police officers. And so they tried to infiltrate the Italian community, I mean, by going to them and saying, who did this? Everybody knew who did it. They knew who did it. They arrested the guys who did it, but they couldn't prove anything. And so they had to let these guys go. So what they did was they brought in an Italian, another Italian, who would then infiltrate the Black Hand. And what I want to do now is I want to show you a clip from the film, Black Hand Strawman. And Brian, so this will be Oliveira, the first one, and then we need the lights to go down as well. And then I'll pick up the story after that. On April 8, 1911, 10 days after Joe Ramo was assassinated, Louis A. Oliveira joined the Kansas City Police Department. Oliveira was born in Pastina, Italy. As a cop, he is described as having been fearless against the Black Hand and quickly rose to the rank of detective. Oliveira had nurtured an informant within Black Hand ranks and was given first-hand information. Detective Oliveira's informant explained that one method of targeting a victim was to pore over tax records at the Jackson County Courthouse, revealing who within the Sicilian community had money and could pay extortion demands. On July 29, 1915, police arrested 7 men and were on the lookout for 4 more, all accused of being Black Handers. These men had arrived in America just a few years before with few possessions, and yet within just a short time, they could afford to own their own businesses. Greed caused the men arrested in 1915 to overstep their bounds. The good Sicilians of Little Italy simply could not meet the monthly demands of the Black Hand. 15 men, described as some of the most prominent of Little Italy, shuffled down to the police department and told how each of them had received extortion letters and each paid between $1,000 and $5,000, and that they could provide a list of names with hundreds more victims.
The police chief called a number of the citizens of the Italian community and said, stand with me. How many of you will stand with me and help me? And one by one they filed out of the meeting and he was left sitting there alone. I understand why, because the threats were real. People were being murdered, bombed, beaten.
After the arrest, a woman described as a widow with property worth $10,000 told that she had received a demand for $2,000. And she identified Joseph D. Giovanni as one of the men who made the demand. Joseph Scarface D. Giovanni, one of the founding members of La Cosa Nostra in Kansas City. He and his brother Sugar House Pete were born in Sicily in the 1880s. Joe arrived in KC in 1912 and immediately engaged in Black Hand extortion activities. During World War I, the Di Giovannis, along with fellow Sicilian James Balistreri, had a black market sugar operation. Because of the war, commodities like sugar were in high demand on the black market. But after the war, when the economy was rebounding, the black marketeers were stuck with a lot of high-priced sugar. According to fire insurance men, Joe Di Giovanni set fire to the warehouse where the sugar was stored. He bungled the job and ended up burning his face and hands, earning him the nickname Scarface. For years, Di Giovanni maintained that he was injured in a gas explosion.
Joseph Di Giovanni and his brother Pete Di Giovanni, along with Jim Balistreri, were mentioned prominently during this era. I don't think there's any question that they were probably very active and quickly gained stature.
One target was Samuel Brancato, who owned a grocery store at 429 East 6th Street. Brancato refused to pay the Black Hand and instead put up lights all around his residence and hired a black man with a shotgun to keep guard.
Hey, Mr. Black Hand comes snooping around here, he sure will find these two black hands among them.
When my aunt was born, they sent a letter to my grandmother. And in this letter, it was signed with a big black hand, and they demanded money. My grandmother really became hysterical because they never had any trouble with the Mafia. She and my grandfather decided that they would go and ask the head of the Mafia, a Mr. and Mrs. Balistreri, to be her godparents. So there wasn't any more problems, there wasn't any more letters that came or anything.
The Black Hand method of extortion continued unabated in Kansas City, and in 1919, Luis Oliveira rounded up 17 more men as Black Hand suspects, but Little Italy's code of silence reigned. After years of threats and attempts on his life, Detective Luis Oliveira paid the ultimate price for being an honest cop. On Friday, November 29, 1930, shortly after 7 a.m., Oliveira left his home at 808 Lydia and was walking to work when a dark Buick sedan rounded the corner and blasted him in the face with a sawed-off shotgun. He left a wife and 7-year-old son.
So, one of the things you should understand about the way I make films is I make them for audiences like this. I really delve into detail that if you had a national filmmaking company come in, they cannot give you the depth of detail that I like to give audiences, like, you know, specific addresses, specific dates, and things like that. That national audiences just wouldn't be interested in absorbing. But if you're from this area and you know these, you know the geography a little bit, all that kind of stuff resonates with you. One of the things about the Black Hand is that it was unorganized. Little criminal cells. You know, there wasn't like, you know, one entity or one, you know, body that was in control. It was just little independent criminals. And so what happened was Prohibition came around, right? The gift to criminals, right? Politicians like James A. Reed loathed Prohibition. Matter of fact, James A. Reed from Missouri stood on the Senate floor and he said, on Monday, I'm going to name names of every senator and congressman that I've ever had a drink with. Monday came around and the halls of Congress were empty. So this grand experiment of Prohibition comes in. Well, we all know that that was just a gift to criminals. So what happened was there was still Black Hand extortion going on within the Italian community. But with Prohibition, extortion against your fellow countrymen became passé because there was so much money to be made in booze manufacturing and booze distribution. And what happened was these sugar houses sprung up around Kansas City again. So the DiGiovanni's had one, the Balistreri's had one, the Carollos had one, and a couple other families had one, and DeFeo's had one. And they got the bright idea saying, well, instead of us competing against one another, let's join forces and organize our booze manufacturing and distribution. And so that's what they did. And so Kansas City became a major hub for alcohol distribution to places like Joplin and Pittsburgh, Kansas, and St. Joe and Columbia and Jeff City and all the Wichita, Des Moines, all the surrounding areas. And it was at this point in time that the Black Handers, these guys who were criminals from the get-go, they kind of wanted to take a back role. They didn't want to be known as the head of what was becoming organized crime around the country. I mean, the same thing was going on elsewhere around the country. And so on election day, 1928, it was a municipal election in March, for a bond, a Pendergast-backed bond issue. On that day, 4 Pendergast poll workers were kidnapped and held at gunpoint. And the man responsible for it contacted Tom Pendergast and he said, "We will kill these guys if you do not give us political control of Little Italy. We want home rule." This was a big deal because the Irish at this time, under Pendergast, controlled the politics in Little Italy. Now, the Italians had been loyal Democrats for the last 28 years because they joined with Big Jim Pendergast when they first got James A. Reed elected as mayor of Kansas City. And so the Pendergasts and the Italians had always been allies with each other. But now the Italians were asserting their muscle. And Pendergast said, well, wait a minute. How about this? Why don't we have 2 political clubs in your district? I'll have mine, you'll have yours. I said, no. We get one club and it's ours and we run it. And so Pendergast knew he could not go to war against the Italians. And so he assented. And from that point on, in 1928, Johnny Lazia became the front man for the Kansas City mob, the Mafia. And he was like this with Tom Pendergast. And it was at that point in time that Pendergast formally entered into an association with the elements of organized crime. Now, if you read your history, you'll know that Johnny Lazia attended that Mafia confab that they had in Jersey City when Al Capone went crazy. It was like one of the first national meetings of Italian criminals. If you ever watch Boardwalk Empire, I think that they reference that. It's pretty well documented. Johnny Lazia was there representing Kansas City. Al Capone probably was suffering from, syphilitic addiction or affliction, and started ripping the paintings off the wall and breaking furniture and making a big scene, which is exactly what they didn't want to happen. Everybody was mad at Al Capone for what he was doing. But so it shows right away that Johnny Lazia had the stature that he needed. He had the support of the criminals that were the Black Handers, the ones that were behind the booze manufacturing operations. He had the support of them, and he became the front man for the Kansas City Mafia. Now, this is during a period of incredible turmoil and dynamism within Kansas City. This film, Tom and Harry, the Boss and the President, is the definitive documentary film about the Pendergast machine. You don't become a political boss overnight by thumping your chest and declaring that you're going to be a political boss. There's a number of things that have to occur over time that allow you to assume that position. One of the things is that you've got the backing of the Mafia. That doesn't hurt at all. And it also helps if you have control of the police department, if you have control of the city manager's office, if you have control of the city council, if you have control of the county government with Harry Truman sitting in spot, giving out jobs to Democrats right and left, control of Congress, control of the governor, control of the flow of New Deal money coming through into the state. Pendergast was responsible for 80,000 jobs at one point during the 30s, during the Depression, because of the New Deal money that was coming through. So Pendergast was incredibly powerful. And on election day, he'd get anybody he wanted elected. And so that's one of the reasons why Kansas City's Mafia is so much better than St. Louis Mafia. Now, they may build better arches, but we produce better criminal systems. And the reason being is because the Kansas City mob was allowed to just go, was just allowed to expand from 1926, when Tom Pendergast became the undisputed political boss, to the day he walked into prison in 1939. You're talking 13 years of nothing but utter graft and corruption throughout the ranks of, both inside and outside government of Kansas City. So much so that they had a deal. They had a deal with Johnny Lazia. Hey, you keep down crime, outside crime, big crime. Don't let big stuff happen in Kansas City, and we'll let you have your prostitution. You can have your booze manufacturing. You can have your gambling, and we'll leave you alone. And so that was kind of the deal that was in place. Rarely ever worked, or maybe it worked a little bit, but there's so many events that were in contravention to the deal that you can't help but almost chuckle at the at their attempt to allow organized crime to become almost a sub-police force. And that's what they were. When the city manager's daughter was kidnapped, it was Johnny Lazia who went around and raised the ransom money and then helped the police find the kidnappers. And when Nelly Don, obviously, was kidnapped, it was Johnny Lazia who rescued her. So they relied on Lazia and the criminal element to figure out what in the world was going on criminal-wise in Kansas City, and there was just a boatload of stuff going on. But you don't be a mob boss in Kansas City or anywhere without having a really good gang behind you. And Johnny Lazia assembled some of the most sinister characters you can possibly imagine. And I'm gonna roll tape right now on, it's actually a DVD. I'm gonna roll this DVD and I'm gonna introduce you to Johnny Lazia's gang members.
Lazia divided the city into 5 racketeering districts, each operated by close associates, most of whom he had grown up with in Little Italy. There was Anthony Gizzo, an ex-convict who, starting in 1924, served 2 years in a federal penitentiary for possession of a large quantity of heroin, opium, and cocaine. When arrested, he offered federal officers $10,000 to let him go. The Kefauver Committee identified Gizzo as being one of the 5 Iron Men of Kansas City, those 5 men who were running the Mafia in 1950. His driver in 1950 was a young man named Nick Civella. Another important Lazia associate was Gaetano Lococo, also identified by the Kefauver Committee as one of the 5 Iron Men of KC. Gaetano, or Tano as he was often called, was co-owner of the Ringside Athletic Club at Independence Avenue and Locust Street. On November 19, 1928, the 2-story building, insured for $42,000, was destroyed completely by an explosion that blew out hundreds of windows in an area 12 blocks square. It was the most violent explosion in Northland history. The presence of oil-soaked timbers and the terrific force of the blast evidenced arson. Lazia's inner circle also included Charles Moonface Carollo, or Charlie the Wop, as he was often called in the press. Charlie Carollo had grown up next door to Lazia in Little Italy. Often characterized as a bodyguard and chauffeur, Carollo was more of a business associate for Lazia than anything else. In fact, Charlie Carollo took the fall for Lazia when the feds came in and busted up a bootleg service in which Lazia and Carollo were leasing cars to the bootleggers. Another close associate was Sam Scola, alias Sam Hogg, a bootlegger and a strong-armed thug for Lazia, who would be called upon to perpetrate an infamous murder in Kansas City. Perhaps the most notorious of Johnny Lazia's gang was Charles Mad Dog Gargata, a gangster's gangster. His record of arrests and convictions was so voluminous that the Kefauver Committee made it exhibit number 12. The committee chairman is quoted as having said, "If ever a human being deserved the title of Mad Dog, it was Gargata."
By the time he joins the Lazia inner circle, they're the people that were being promoted. He was an established tough guy. He was an established criminal. He was the poster boy for that word that was used, a police character.
Over the years, Charlie Gargata was arrested for murder, assault with intent to kill, burglary, possession of stolen U.S. property, possession of corn whiskey, frequenting gambling houses, occupying a room for immoral purposes, extortion, kidnapping, resisting arrest, and many charges of vagrancy. 3 years younger than Lazia, Gargata was a go-to guy for any type of violence required to transact business. His younger brother by 4 years, Gus Skinny Gargata, was also in the rackets, a gambler and bootlegger. Gus Gargata owned the notorious Chesterfield Club, located at 320 East 9th Street, 1 block from the federal courthouse downtown, where the businessman's lunch featured soup, striptease.
The Chesterfield Club, you know, the waitresses wore nothing but cellophane aprons, see-through cellophane aprons and shoes. That's all they wore. They would shave their pubic hair in shapes of the pips of suits of cards. They'd pick up their tips without using their hands.
So in the 1930s, let's just talk a little bit about this, just to kind of let you know how crazy it was. In 1930, you had the kidnapping of one of the Katz brothers of the drugstore. Of course, you had the Nelly Don kidnapping. You had the Mary McElroy kidnapping. Pretty Boy Floyd had come to town numerous times and caused all kinds of problems. They had a big shootout at a flower shop on Independence Avenue. The first time that a machine gun was used in Kansas City was at 11th and Broadway. In 1933, June 17th, you had the Union Station Massacre when they were bringing Frank Nash through Union Station. He was manacled at the time, and he was being escorted by a phalanx of lawmen. And Pretty Boy Floyd and Vern Miller and Adam Ricchetti opened fire on them, and Frank Nash ended up having his head blown off by an FBI guy, and 4 other lawmen died, came to be known as the Kansas City Union Station Massacre. I have a film on that. It was commissioned by Union Station. I did it on their behalf for their 75th anniversary of the massacre. Then in July of 1933, Bonnie and Clyde kind of blew through town where they passed Kansas City, but they got that big shootout up in Platte County. Then in August of 1933, Charlie Gargata, Gaetano Lococo, Sam Scola, and another guy named Gus Fassone had a big shootout on Armour Boulevard with Sheriff Bash. He happened to come across what they call a spot murder. Spot murders was part of the Kansas City vernacular. If someone was put on the spot, that meant they got whacked. And so it was late at night, like 1 o'clock in the morning, and Sheriff Bash is coming home from an ice cream social. He's being driven by his deputy and his wife and a little orphan girl in the back seat, and they come up to the corner of Armour and Forest, and outside of an apartment building, there's Gaetano Lococo and Charlie Gargata just pumping bullets into a guy. And Bash says, pull over. And then Sam Skoll is driving, and he sees, Bash's patrol car, so he starts heading right toward the patrol car. He's going to ram the patrol car. Bash, who is a crack duck hunter, pulls out his shotgun, and bam, he blows away Sam Skoll, and bam, he kills Gus Fassone. Gaetano Lococo's running away, and Charlie Gargano's walking across the street and just firing bam, 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 right at Sheriff Bash, missing every time. Now the reason why is 45s are meant for close-up killing. You get more than 20, 30 feet away, cops will tell you this, 45, you don't know what direction it's gonna go. And so Sheriff Bash was about to blow Gargano away, and Gargano said, no, don't shoot, I'm a friend of Johnny Lazia. And of course, it was a huge mess of a trial. Gargano got off again and again. And then in February of 1934, Johnny Lazia was convicted of a tax evasion. In March of 1934, you had the bloody elections in Kansas City where 4 people were killed at the polls. Gangsters were going around beating people up to make sure that Pendergast issues won and the Pendergast candidates won. And then in July of 1934, you had the assassination of Johnny Lazia on Armour Boulevard. And it was Johnny Lazia's assassination that gave the FBI the solution to the Union Station massacre. When I first was endeavoring to research organized crime in Kansas City, I wasn't even sure I was going to include the Kansas City massacre, the Union Station massacre, because it ostensibly didn't look like it had anything to do with organized crime. But what happened was after Johnny Lazia was assassinated, and you should know that he was right there on Armour Boulevard, in an apartment, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, Charlie Carollo's driving. There's 2 assassins hiding behind a wall, one with a shotgun, one with a machine gun. Johnny Lazia steps out and they just start blowing him to death. And he yells to Carolla, get the hell out of here, because his wife is in the car. And he's lying there in the middle of the drive, screaming in agony for someone to come, please help him. They take him to St. Joseph Hospital where he is in utter pain for 12 hours. They blood transfusion after blood transfusion with him. The man was screaming his brains out and yelling, and the hospital was flooded with people, and they had Mafia guards all around the perimeter of the hospital. And one of the last words that Johnny Lazia said was, he gasped and he said, please tell my friend Tom Pendergast I love him. And he died. And then what happened was a mob war broke out. And so Kansas City was on fire in 1934. It was crazy. And what was happening also is that gangsters from around the country, the rogue gangsters, would come and lay low in Kansas City because it was part of what they called the corridor of crime at that time. It went from Texas to Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, and up to St. Paul, Minnesota. That was another safe haven for criminals. So Kansas City was just gonzo. And the political situation was even crazier because Tom Pendergast controlled things. And not only were 4 people killed at the polls in 1934, in 1936 was the largest vote fraud prosecution in the history of the United States. 278 people were indicted and 259 were convicted of vote fraud, federal vote fraud. Now you'll never see another prosecution like that again. I don't know how it could ever. We get worried that 3 people in Kansas in the last 20 years might have checked the wrong ballot. I mean, these guys are amateurs compared to what was going on during the Pendergast era. So Kansas City is just wide open. And of course, you know what else is going on? Because they allowed, now, Prohibition's over by the mid-30s, but they allow the bars to just stay open. They purposely pay the police poorly. The police had to buy their own blackjacks, their own guns, their own handcuffs, their own uniforms, and they paid them like $1,200 a year, and they had to pay a lug to the Pendergast machine, a cut of their salary. So that at the end of the day, they made about $700 a year. Now, why did they do that? Because they wanted the police department to take bribes so that they would leave the sin businesses alone. And that's what they did. So what happens is Kansas City becomes a cradle of jazz because all these musicians start flocking to Kansas City because there's work, baby. Man, there's one speakeasy, one club, one saloon right after another. And it's amazing to look in the Kansas City Star and the Kansas City Journal, and even during Prohibition, they're advertising full display ads about come on down to the Hey Hey Club, come on down to, God, they had so many different names for clubs, Dante's Inferno, come on down, party, dance, drinks, anything you want. And it's all being advertised. And it's just like, they're just flinging it in the face of the feds. Why? Because the Kansas City Police Department is so corrupt that after the Union Station massacre, the feds didn't even include Kansas City Police in the investigation. The only guy they included was Sheriff Roy Bash. He was the only one that they could trust. So you have this combination of corruption within the political atmosphere. Now you may wonder, well, why in the world did people in Kansas City allow this to go on, right? Why didn't the good citizenry of Kansas City stand up to this? Well, because everybody was employed. If the Pendergast machine had a machine that could do the job of 20 men, they hired 20 men. They would put men to work, not machines to work. You ought to see the pictures of when they're digging out Brush Creek. It's ridiculous. It's like an army of men out there with pickaxes and shovels. They're going to lay concrete across Brush Creek. Why? You know what the first thing that happened, the first rainfall? It flooded the plaza. It was the dumbest idea in the world. But it was just a way to put people to work. And that's what they did. Now, a lot of people want to say that Tom Pendergast was a gangster. He was not a gangster. He was not a mob boss. He never ordered hits on anybody. What he was a corrupt influencer. He learned early on that he could do much more business with government by being outside of government rather than being on the inside of government. In Tom and Harry, I went down to at University of Missouri. They have Western historical manuscript, and they have a Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist named Fitzpatrick, Daniel Fitzpatrick, during the 1930s. And he drew more than 100 cartoons of Pendergast. And I went down there and got every one of those cartoons. And it is hilarious because you can really see the St. Louis perspective of Kansas City. They're just like over here going, why do you allow this guy to control your government over there? But he controlled a bunch of St. Louis too. And it's through a whole series of events. But today we're talking about organized crime. And so one of the things also about Kansas City is it's a major heroin distribution hub. The heroin comes in from the opium fields of Afghanistan. It goes to Marseille, France. Then it goes to Havana, Cuba, Tampa, Florida, Kansas City. And Kansas City distributed heroin throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, and the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I'm going to say one name, Charlie Parker. When Charlie Parker left Kansas City, he was hopelessly addicted to heroin. Italian heroin, Mafia heroin. And of course, he died of heroin. And so they had a big drug bust in 1943 between the Antonori family in Tampa and the Kansas City family. And they broke up the drug distribution ring in Kansas City. And after that point, Kansas City has never been a major heroin drug distribution point at all. Now, there are some romantic reasons given as to why. And one of them is that when Nick Civella rose to power, the guy that was underneath him had a son who was addicted to morphine. And Nick Civella could see the negative effects of drugs on people, and so he didn't want his people to be involved in drugs and distributing poison throughout the community. Probably the better reason is that much stiffer sentences were in place for people that dealt drugs. I doubt it had very much to do with nobility and morality. But so Pendergast goes to prison in 1939. He's sentenced to 15 months. He serves a year and a day. He's a ruined man after that. Comes back to Kansas City. His wife has left him. He's living in this huge mansion at 57th and Ward Parkway. He's a broken man. And they've totally dissected, disseminated, and killed the machine. The machine is in tatters. What's funny is after the big vote fraud prosecution in 1938, the Pendergast machine still slaughtered everybody, but this time they did it legitimately. They didn't even have to cheat. They had so much control. But the ward bosses and the precinct officers were trying to curry favor with Boss Tom. So they were more than happy to, steal ballot boxes, mark up ballots, create phony ballots. I mean, any possible way you can think of cheating, they did it. And so Tom Pendergast is toppled in 1939. The state of Missouri takes back the Kansas City Police Department. Now, the reason why they got it in the first place, why Kansas City had it, was that in 1930, the Pendergast machine had been like saying, Henry McElroy, the corrupt city manager, we want home rule over our own police department. We want to be able to control our own police department. It's ridiculous that we can't control our own police department. And the Missouri Supreme Court said, you know what, we agree with you because it's taxation without representation. You have a board that's non-Kansas City controlling your police department, and yet the taxes of the Kansas City taxpayers are going to fund the police department. So here you go, Kansas City, you can have your police department back to you. Now, a lot of wags would say the Supreme Court just wanted to get the police department off the state rolls because it was costing the state money, to support the police department. But nevertheless, that's why that's why Pendergast had control of the police department for most of his time while he was in power. And of course, that's why Kansas City still doesn't have control of its police department because of when Pendergast was in power. Kansas City still doesn't trust itself with its own police department. It's the only major municipality left in the United States that doesn't control its own police department. So after Lazia was killed in 1934, Charlie Carollo stepped up, but he wasn't quite as strong of a figure as Lazia, and he also got sent off to prison in 1939. He was the bag man for Pendergast. He would actually go to Pendergast's office, 1908 Main Street, and drop off bags of money. So in the 1940s, there starts to develop a little bit of a vacuum in leadership until this guy named Charlie Binaggio comes on the scene. And this guy is probably the most forgotten mobster, but yet most important mobster in Kansas City history, in the sense that he tried to resurrect the connection between the political machine and the mafia. And he borrowed money from the national syndicate, and he said, hey, if you give me a bunch of money, I will work on getting the right politicians elected, and we're going to get Missouri opened up to gambling. Okay, this is what Charlie Binaggio said. Now, Charlie Binaggio is running with Charlie Gargano. He's running with Gaetano Lococo. He is running with Tony Gizzo. You've got, this is the same guys that are still, very much involved in organized crime. And they have this place called the Last Chance Saloon. It's on Southwest Boulevard. It's right where the Kansas and Missouri state lines meet. And they had a diagonal line drawn across the saloon, so that when the Missouri cops would come, they just move all the gambling equipment over to the Kansas side. And then when the Kansas cops would come, they just move all the equipment over to the Missouri side. And for some reason, the two jurisdictions could never coordinate their raids on the Last Chance. And so Binaggio wants to own this place, and he tells the owner, Fred Reniger, he says, hey, we want to buy in, we're going to buy you out. And Fred says, no, I don't want to sell. He said, well, yeah, you need to sell. And then Fred says, no. So what happens? Fred ends up dead. They killed Fred. And then there's this guy named Wolf Ryman. Wolf Ryman was an assistant Jackson County sheriff. And Wolf Ryman is also a golf pro at Hillcrest Country Club. And he's also got this little company where he supplies the roadhouses around Jackson County with jukeboxes and pinball machines. So he goes to all these roadhouses and he says, hey, if you don't put in my pinball machines in my jukeboxes, I'm going to have the county sheriff's department raid your place. Because Kansas City, Missouri stopped serving alcohol at midnight, but the roadhouses were dry, but they would serve soft drinks. So you could bring, your bottle in with you, and then, you just mix it with the soft drinks, and they'd have bands playing till all night. So what happened was, after Pendergast fell, the corruption in the city got exported to these roadhouses around Kansas City in Jackson County. So this guy, Wolf Ryman, he basically forces everybody to buy his machines. And then he decides he wants to get into the liquor distribution business. All right? Well, he's going to get a franchise, of a liquor franchise that was already franchised to Superior Wine and Liquors, John Blondo. And it was the Schenley liquor line, okay? I don't even know if they exist anymore, but Schenley manufactured alcohol back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And so Wolf Ryman is warned by Charlie Binaggio, don't do this. Do not go into this business. This is my friend John Blondo's, and John doesn't appreciate you encroaching on his territory. And Wolf Ryman just, he just dismisses Charlie Binaggio. So Wolf Ryman is coming out of a building at 11th and Chestnut one afternoon, sunny afternoon, and a car whips around the corner. Two guys get out. One of them stands guard like this. Meanwhile, the car's just chugging away with the driver in there. And one guy just slowly walks over and bam, 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 shoots Wolf Ryman, broad daylight. And then he turns around, and there's people everywhere. And he turns around and he looks at him as if, I dare you to try and identify me. They get back in their car and they drive off. And so, at this point in time, Charlie Binaggio is gaining national attention. The newspapers and the magazines, national magazines, are featuring him saying, is there a new political menace in Missouri? Who is this Charlie Binaggio guy? He's the Mafia, and he's insinuating himself into politics in Missouri. We got Pendergast happening all over again, but he's even worse this time. And so the national Mafia is looking at this, right? The guys in New York gave Binaggio the money, Costello, and some other big names. The order goes out. Charlie's got to go. Now, during this period, Harry Truman is president of the United States, right? And Harry Truman did not come from an unsullied past himself, He had very close association with the Pendergast machine. So there was this guy named Kefauver, Senator Estes Kefauver, who wanted to hold hearings about organized crime around the United States, but Harry Truman had been saying, don't do it, because they'll just use organized crime as a reason to beat up on Democrats in the elections. And then secondly, I don't want all this stuff about me and Pendergast coming out again. I'm just tired of dealing with it, And so that was okay, Estes Kefauver backed off. But then events spiraled out of control, which Harry Truman could not possibly control. And I want to show you the next clip. And you're going to be introduced to Charlie Binaggio in kind of a different way.
On the afternoon of April 5th, 1950, Charlie Binaggio worked out in his yard. He then cleaned up, had dinner, and was picked up by his driver, Nick Penna. They headed down to the Last Chance Bar, which Binaggio now partially owned, and met up with Charlie Gargata. The two men had a whispered conversation. Then Gargata asked Homer Cooper, a gambler from Council Bluffs, Iowa, if he could borrow Cooper's 1949 yellow convertible coupe. Cooper agreed. Binaggio told his driver, Nick Penna, "No need to come, Nick. We'll be back in 15 or 20 minutes. Around 4 in the morning on April 6, 1950, cab driver W.A. Gamble heard water running into the First Ward Democratic headquarters. The blinds were closed, and so he called police to report what he presumed was a busted water line dripping into the building. Police then came upon one of the country's most rippling hits in mob history. On Truman Boulevard, underneath a huge photo of Harry Truman in Democratic headquarters, lay 49-year-old Charlie Gargata with 4 .32 caliber gunshot wounds to the head, 3 of them point blank into his left eye. About 25 feet away lay 41-year-old Charlie Binaggio, caught completely unaware of the danger he was in. The gunpowders were so thick that the shooter probably pressed the gun against Binaggio's head and shot him 4 times, neatly spaced, with one directly into his left eye.
He was with people that he knew and trusted. This was done by people known to these 2 people and were local executioners.
Neither Binaggio or Gargata were armed. There was no evidence of struggle nor evidence of robbery. Binaggio's cigarette holder lay on the floor and a cigarette butt was found in his chair, indicating he was relaxed when shot. Apparently Gargata sensed some danger because he was headed toward the door, and when he was shot, he grasped at the blinds before falling. President Truman was vacationing in Key West in Florida as the news burned up the lines of wire services out of Kansas City that morning. Howls of indignation came from Congress, denouncing the lawlessness of the president's own city and demanding some action be taken. At first, Truman was silent, instructing aides to merely comment that Truman had no connection to Binaggio and no concern in the case. But back in D.C., the issue became red hot, with Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee again demanding to lead an investigation into organized crime in America. To quell matters, Truman had but little choice to go along this time or otherwise be pilloried by his own party. The Binaggio send-off was reminiscent of Lazia's huge funeral with more than 1,000 people in procession outside Holy Rosary Church at 5th and Holmes. But unlike the gang retribution following Lazia's death 16 years earlier, the aftermath of the Binaggio-Gargata slayings was tellingly peaceful. No revenge by the mob against anybody.
Some word came down from higher-ups in the National Syndicate. This was the timing. It was an enormous event. It had widespread publicity all over the United States, generated more heat in Kansas City, brought the Kefauver Committee here.
Not the least bit coward, the Kefauver Committee investigators created Exhibit Number 9, the Wheel of Mafia, putting the now deceased Charles Binaggio at the center of operations. Anthony Gizzo was in charge of gambling, Charlie Gargata and Gaetano Lococo in charge of strong arm and terror, with Johnny Mangracina or Johnny Mag and Max Jabin working for them. The Mafia wheel pegged many well-known Kansas City businesses as venues for Mafia bookmaking, wire service control, dice games, the policy rackets, nightclubs, liquor, and other businesses. The Kefauver investigators also created Exhibit Number 10, the Mafia baseball field, identifying all alleged members, listing many unsolved murders, and pinpointing companies involved in a dice, bookmaking, liquor control, and bootlegging operation. During hearings, Kansas City's gangsters gave a bravo performance in evasion and obfuscation. Joe DiGiovanni was most uneloquent, advising the committee he could neither read nor write. In total, 48 witnesses testified during the KC Kefauver Committee hearings. The committee recommended that Joe DiGiovanni be prosecuted for perjury, finding his amnesia to be incredible. But DiGiovanni never was prosecuted, and while the Kefauver hearings exposed Kansas City's underworld and perhaps embarrassed its members, there was no wholesale cleanup afterwards. Many gambling activities temporarily ceased and spot murders declined a bit. During this period following Binaggio's death in April 1950, Anthony Gizzo was generally considered the boss of Kansas City's Mafia, but his reign did not last long. On April 1st, 1953, Gizzo was in Dallas to visit his son Robert, who was incarcerated on narcotics robbery charges. Gizzo suffered a coronary occlusion and died in a hospital, leaving a gap in leadership and setting the stage for the man whose criminal control would go unchallenged for the next 25 years.
I just want to mention a quick anecdote. And that is, first thing is that if you go to the Mob Museum out in Las Vegas, which if you're at all interested in this subject, it is great. It's by the same people that do the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, and they do the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. So it's incredibly well done out in Vegas. And the first murder they start with is Charlie Binaggio and Charlie Gargata. It was a major, major criminal event in the history of the United States organized crime. And the reason why they shoot the guy in the left eye, that's a Mafia calling card. It's because it prevents there being an open casket. They can't have an open casket that way. Now I'm being told I need to wind this thing up, and I'm really just getting wound up, actually. Suffice it to say that Nick Civella comes on the scene, right? And Nick Civella is able to take control because he has the benediction of the National Mafia. He was caught as part of that 1957 confab of mafioso up in Appalachian, New York, at the estate of Joseph Barbara, and where they chased all the hoods through the backwoods in their Gucci loafers and their silk suits and everything. And Nick Civella was up there with the owner of the Roma Bakery, who was up there to introduce him to the national syndicate, as this is now the guy in Kansas City. Nick Civella early on kidnapped Roy Williams from a Teamsters meeting in the 1950s, put him under a spotlight and said that if you don't do as I say, I will kill your family, and he listed his children, I will kill your wife, and then I will kill you. So from that moment on, Roy Williams and the Teamsters was Nick's boy. And so Nick promoted Roy Williams all the way up through the Teamsters for years. And that's how Roy Williams, even under indictment, became president of the Teamsters. Nick Civella controlled everything. He was undisputed. He finally went to prison because of the 1970 Super Bowl between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Minnesota Vikings. The police had recorded Nick's hideout, the trap, where they were conducting their doing their bookmaking. And the thing was that nobody in the Chiefs, or nobody in Kansas City was betting against the Chiefs, even though they kept, raising the payout if Minnesota won. Nobody in Kansas City would bet against the Chiefs. So, that's not the way bookmakers make a book, right? I mean, they don't make money by having a disproportionate book like that. So they're way out of balance. Nick Civella calls up and says, well, how bad is it? And the guy goes, $50,000. He goes, well, we're out of balance, $50,000. He goes, well, what's going on? He said, well, nobody's betting against the Chiefs. And Civella goes, all right, I guess there's nothing we can do about it. And bang, that conversation got him arrested. And he went to prison 7 years later. Oscar Goodman and a bunch of other lawyers, Oscar Goodman's mayor of Vegas, and a bunch of other lawyers managed to keep Nick out of prison that whole time. The Godfather movie came out at that time, and Nick said that he couldn't get a fair trial because everybody was calling him the Godfather of Kansas City. When The Godfather came out, and I open up the film Black Hand Strawman this way, when The Godfather came out in Kansas City, the Italian community bought out the Empire Theater and then refused to go see the film. And so CBS Evening News that night shows Kansas City, the Empire Theater, and then they go in and they record The Godfather on the screen with nobody in the seats. And then they cut to a party down the street where the Italians are dancing and having a good time, and then they cut back to The Godfather. Nobody there. Then they go back to the party and everybody's having a great time. That's the way they closed out their newscast that night when The Godfather opened in Kansas City. And I opened my film in March of 2009 on the anniversary that The Godfather opened in Kansas City. As you know, big wars in Kansas City, the River Key War. I got one more clip. Should I show this clip or do we got to skedaddle?
Show it.
Okay, I guess we won't show it.
Show it.
Let me just set this up real quickly. Go ahead. River Key War, very complicated. Basically, when they built the Marriott Hotel in Kansas City, they had to wipe out the Mafia businesses, and they needed to relocate to the River Key. And so this is a partial synopsis of the River Key War. It's a fairly complicated event. This film is 2 hours and 13 minutes long. So just to give you an idea.
The outfit was actually waging two gangland wars simultaneously during the 1970s, and events relating to both overlap. The North End Spiro family, comprised of 4 brothers said to be a fearsome bunch, not afraid of anyone, were making unacceptable inroads into outfit territory. Specifically, the eldest brother, Nick Spiro, was gaining influence over Teamsters Union Local 41, the province of Nick Civella. On April 12, 1973, authorities found Nick Spiro dead in the trunk of his 1968 Cadillac. He had been shot in the temple and in the chest. At the time, brother Carl Spiro was in jail, but he swore revenge for those responsible for the death of his oldest brother. On November 17, 1976, John Brocato, said to be in the Spiro brothers' camp, was found in the trunk of his car at Kansas City International Airport. He had been tortured and strangled. And yet the killing continued. More persons with murky connections to the outfit or the Spiro brothers. On July 22, 1976, Kansas City police found a 1965 Ford Mustang abandoned near 9th and Olive with red liquid dripping from the trunk. Blood from the body of David Bonadonna, shot just a few hours earlier. Willie the Rat is generally suspected of having orchestrated the hit. On February 19, 1977, John Amaro, also known as Johnny Green, was shot to death in his own garage near 50th and North Flora, just a few doors down from Nick Civella's home. Johnny Green was a Civella bookmaker and owner of John's Saloon in the River Key. 3 days later, on February 22nd, Sonny Bowen, convicted thief and sometime bodyguard of Fred Bonadonna, sat down for a drink at Mr. O'Brien's bar at 35th and Broadway. Shortly thereafter, 3 masked men walked in, said nothing, and shotgunned Sonny Bowen to death. 5 weeks later, on March 28, 2 huge explosions rocked the side-by-side saloons known as Pat O'Brien's and Judge Roy Bean's at 4th and Wyandotte. By now, Fred Bonadonna was in hiding and was cooperating with the FBI. Gary Parker, or Parker T, had been warned by police that he was a target for the mob, but turned down police protection, insisting he could take care of himself. But it was the outfit that took care of Parker T. On a Friday afternoon, August 5th, 1977, 35-year-old Parker T was having the final drink of his life at Louis Bar and Grill at 4127 Truman Road, operated by Tony Bonadonna, Fred's brother and son of David Bonadonna. Parker T left the saloon and got into his car. Somewhere nearby, a killer activated a remote-controlled device, detonating a powerful bomb beneath Parker's car, blowing pieces of his body hither and yon. And yet the killing continued, with the Bonadonna-Spiro faction clearly out of its league and going to war against the Civellas and Camasanos. The coup de grace went down on May 16, 1978, when the 3 remaining Spiro brothers were felled by a hail of gunfire. Around 10 p.m., 3 masked men burst into the tavern, picked out their targets, and opened fire. Michael Spiro, a local Teamster official, was killed. Joseph was shot in the arm, and brother Carl was paralyzed from the waist down when he was shot in the back as he fled into the street. As the shootings and bombings abated, so did any hope of a lively and successful River Key. One by one, businesses closed. Those that survived had been there before the key was developed. And of course, the city market remained. Produce sellers, wholesalers, and established restaurants. Based on the testimony of Fred Bonadonna, both Willie the Rat and Joe Comisano were convicted for extortion for using force to get their way in the River Key. Joe died before serving time. Willie went to prison for 5 years. In early August 1977, after numerous appeals and delays, Nick Civella went to prison on his bookmaking conviction stemming from the Chiefs-Vikings Super Bowl game. Nick Civella returned to Kansas City in June 1978. He had won an early medical discharge from prison because he had intestinal cancer. By early 1980, Nick Civella was back in prison for bribing a prison official in order to win preferential treatment for Tony Wright Civella, Cork's son and Nick's nephew. Tony Wright had been convicted on the same gambling charge that had sent Nick to jail in 1977.
So, you know, people ask me all the time, like, what was the heyday of the Kansas City mob, you know? And I mean, if you think about it, it was so pervasive during the Pendergast era, you could argue that that was the heyday. But then if you think about it, yeah, but you know, probably the biggest hit, one of the biggest hits in all of Mafia history was the Binaggio Gargata hit. And just a real quick anecdote about that. In 1946, when Harry Truman was president, he decided he didn't like the local congressman, Roger Slaughter, and he wanted Slaughter voted out of office. So he calls up his good buddy Jim Pendergast, Tom's nephew, and says, hey Jim, I want this SOB purged, right? I want him out. And so Jim Pendergast gets together with Charlie Binaggio, and man, they got a mission. They're gonna get rid of this congressman, Roger Slaughter. And so, in so doing, they perpetrated this mass vote fraud during the primary, Democratic primary in 1946. Well, immediately the Kansas City Star starts yelling about an investigation. Excuse me for a second. And so they're issuing subpoenas, they're having grand juries, and until one night in May of 1947, at 3 o'clock in the morning, men break into the Jackson County Courthouse, and using nitroglycerin, they blow open the vaults on the first floor and they steal all of the vote records. And they make their getaway. Now, that just really speaks to just how crazy Kansas City can be with its politics, with its crime, with its culture. With all of that said, I could discourse much longer about a lot of different aspects of crime in Kansas City. Certainly talk more about the Strawman era because it's a fascinating deal. And real quick, I'll tell you what the scheme was. They put the Strawman in place. They then put people, their own mafia people, in the counting rooms. So they were stealing money from the casinos, 4 of them. And the money was coming back in sandwiches to Kansas City. And it was being distributed from Kansas City to Chicago, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. And then the idea was to steal so much money from the casinos that the casinos would go bankrupt. Well, at that point in time, the major creditor of the casinos was the Teamsters Union. So the Teamsters then would take ownership of the casinos. And of course, who controls the Teamsters? The mobsters do. So that was their big plan. These are highly intelligent people. These are not non-thinkers. These are very, people that are thinking like, a chess game, 15 and 20 steps ahead. And you talk with people like Bill Owsley and some of his crime-fighting partners, and they had, in certain ways, they had the, most profound respect for the schemes that these guys came up with. With all of that said, thank you for having me here this evening. I very much appreciate it. And I don't know if we have time for question and answer, but I'd be delighted to take any.